Yes, this is the hypothesis that's dominated my life. Oh gosh, for 45 years now. We think people have two different ways of getting better in a language, and they really are different. One we call the natural way. Synonym is picking up a language. I was in Spain for a couple of weeks and I picked up some Spanish that really means you acquired it. It happens subconsciously. While it's happening, you don't know it's happening. Once you finished acquiring, you don't know that it's there. You have a feeling for correctness. Okay. The other process, and we're very good at it. We're extremely good at language acquisition. The other process we're not very good at, language learning. Language learning is knowing about language, knowing the rules. The noun, the subject, and the verb are supposed to agree. Phonics, two vowels go walking, the first does the talking. The difference between ser and estar, which I still do not know the rule for after all this time. Okay. The third person singular rule, etc. We're not very good at this. This is what our instruction is based on, and this is why we have so much suffering. I thought it was original with me, but it turns out it wasn't, which is actually very gratifying that it's not original with me. After I started talking about it, I discovered other people had similar ideas. Pitt Corder had talked about it in our field. Larry Selinker had actually talked about it in our field. And in other related fields, widely known, one of the great intellectual moments of my life is when I picked up a book by Frank Smith called Reading Without Nonsense. And it's about learning to read. And I picked it up. I read it in one sitting. There it was, my entire theory, all of it, based on different data that I hadn't seen for learning to read as a first language, and beautifully expressed, well put together. This was so gratifying. Ralph Waldo Emerson says, when you come to a hypothesis and you get evidence, you replicate and you get evidence from a neighboring field, that is really powerful. So that is not original with me. And that was one of the most exciting, happy days of my life when that happened. We have found it works in the beginning. It turned out it explained a lot in foreign language teaching, of course, in second language teaching, in literacy. It applies very well to bilingual education. If you use the first language correctly, it makes the second language more comprehensible. It works for heritage language development. The best way to get your heritage language moving is lots and lots of input, lots of pleasure reading, etc. So this is the way it's been. It's been research coming surprise from other directions that confirms it again and again. So this is the big one. I know of these days, I know of no counter evidence. So I'm not going to say it's true. I'm going to say so far, there's no counter evidence. Karl Popper says, I'm going to complain now. Karl Popper says in science, you can't prove anything. You can only get supporting evidence. Someone can always say, you haven't looked at all the possible cases. So if you say all languages have pronouns, well, maybe there's a language that hasn't been evolved yet. Maybe there's Proto-Etruscan that we don't know what it looked like. So you can't, there's always some wise guy in the back who says, well, maybe next year there'll be a counter. Oh, maybe. Okay. But so far it looks good. And we're getting this evidence from other fields, which makes me think it's the one we want to work with and continue to test. So that's acquisition learning. They're very different. I am not opposed to learning. I would never say to teachers, don't ever teach about language. Don't ever explain the rules. Don't ever correct errors. Error correction is an invitation to think the rules again, okay? I would never say, teach grammar, go to jail, okay? What I will say, though, about conscious learning, it's very hard to do and very hard to use. It's limited. I'm not saying it's wrong. For people like us, it can be very satisfying. When you acquire something, then you learn the rule and it makes you feel good. So it's not bad. And there are strange, deviant people like me and some of you who actually think grammar is interesting, who
Yes.
think that Noam Chomsky is one of the great geniuses of all time, which is what I think. Okay. And when I read his descriptions, oh gosh, gorgeous. But you don't have to be like that. Okay. For people like us, it feels wonderful. So here's why it's hard grammar. There are three conditions that have to be met if you want to use grammar, use a rule that you've learned. Number one, you've got to know the rule,
Mhm.
know all the rules, not even close. Even Chomsky, now Noam Chomsky knows more about English than anyone who's ever lived
All the other.
because he his task is to discover universals, and one of his ways of working is to get the right description of any language. And then it's a good, you probably are using universal grammar when you do that. And he's not done. He and his colleagues say we've only described fragments. Chomsky doesn't know all the rules. The linguists don't know all the rules. The best language teachers don't know all the rules. They don't teach all the rules they know. Our best students don't learn all the rules. So this is hopeless. Okay, that's number one. You've got to know the rules if you're going to use language. Number two, you've got to be thinking about correctness if you're going to use the rules. Let's say you're having a conversation and you make a change because you think you're going to do it wrong. You've got to be thinking about correctness. When you do that, you're not listening to the other person. It's true confession time. You guys do this, and I used to do it all the time.
All the time.
Plan your sentence while the other person's talking. You come up with this brilliant sentence, but you weren't listening. And the conversation's now in a different direction.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got to have time to do it. And you've got to be thinking about forms. You got to know the rule, you got to be thinking about rules, and you got to have time. The only time these conditions are met is when you take a grammar test. It doesn't happen in the real world. It only happens when we take a grammar test. You've studied the rule, you're thinking about correctness, and usually the written test, you have time to think about the rule. Okay. Our study is done back in the 80s. Even when these conditions are met, people don't use a lot of grammar. So again, I'm not against it, but I think we have to recognize its limitations. I started really thinking about this when I was in Cuernavaca, and I had 2 weeks hanging out with Spanish teachers. Okay. We had lunch and dinner together. We had a good time. It was wonderful. And I made the decision then not to worry about correctness. And I have to thank Steve Kaufman for this. He says, don't worry about correctness. Nobody cares. They're more interested in what you're saying, not how you, and that was liberating. Okay. So, and I realized then this is the path. I didn't think about grammar, and I absorbed a lot from what I read, from the conversations I had, etc. So to summarize, there are these two different ways. They're really different, and we are backing the wrong horse. We're backing the grammar conscious learning horse. It's gradually changing. Let me bring up an unpleasant reality. There's a huge obstacle to this ever working. I have been working on this 40 years. My colleagues have put together an enormous amount of data that says this is a promising avenue that we really need to work on acquisition. It's not happening in classrooms. When I look at descriptions and catalogs, community college French class, it's grammar all the way. A few people are doing it. People in the audience know about it, etc. But it's not really doing that well when you think of all the research behind it. And there's a good reason. If what my colleagues and I have been saying is right, is an unbelievable economic disaster for the textbook publishing industry and for the testing industry. Trillions of dollars worldwide. And this is, I think, the main reason why it's not doing better. And I don't know the answer, just keep presenting the research, et cetera. because all those textbooks are now obsolete. A couple are okay for reference if you're interested in grammar, but it's not the core, and the testing industry has to change.
Mhm.
Now that we're all depressed.
If you like what you just saw and want to see the whole interview, please click here.
Or if you want to know what other great content RML has to offer, here are the YouTube recommendations. And as always, please click on that big button in the middle to subscribe.
See you soon.